The throne room of Ethelgard was burning. Seraphina didn't run. She stood at the center of the marble floor. Silk gown soaked through, dark hair plastered to the curve of her throat, and watched the Beast King of the Wilderlands tear through her father's last 6 guards like they were made of parchment. No blade, no shield. Just those enormous scarred hands and a brutality so efficient it barely looked like violence at all. It looked like weather, like something the world simply had to endure. The last guard dropped. The throne room went quiet except for the rain and the fire, and the sound of her own breathing, which she was already working to control. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. You are not afraid. Fear is data. Collect it. Fenris' vein turned. She had studied portraits of him, commissioned intelligence reports, had an entire dossier built from the accounts of soldiers who had faced the moon devourers at the Mirewall and survived long enough to stammer out descriptions before fever took them. She thought she had been prepared. She had not been prepared. He was enormous in the way that ancient things were enormous. Not just in height or shoulder span, though there was plenty of both, but in presence. He occupied the room differently than other men. Like the room had always been his and was simply tolerating the previous occupants. His dark furs were soaked black with rain and with blood that was not entirely his own. The tribal tattoos climbing his throat and jaw looked, in the firelight, like something that moved. His amber eyes swept the ruined throne room once, cataloging, discarding, and then they stopped. They found her. The air changed. His scent reached her a full second before he took a step. Petrichor and crushed pine needles and something electric, sharp, like the sky directly before lightning tears it open. It was the smell of the Wilderlands itself, of something ancient and uncivilized and entirely without apology. Her jasmine perfume. Cold marble, the faint ghost of expensive ink from the treaty document still burning in the grate behind her, must have reached him too, because something shifted in those amber eyes. Not recognition, not softness, nothing so generous as either. It was the look of a predator who had cornered his prey, and found the prey looking back. He crossed the marble floor toward her, unhurried. The firelight threw his shadow long and dark across the pale stone. 6 feet, 2. Seraphina did not step back, she stepped forward. One deliberate, silk-slippered step into the space between them. Close enough to see the exact moment his jaw tightened. Close enough to watch something flicker in those burning amber eyes that he did not have the discipline to hide in time. Good, she noted, filing it away. He didn't expect that. You're going to take me, she said. Her voice came out even. Quiet. The voice she used for treaty negotiations and execution orders, and every room that needed to believe she was not breakable. So take me, but understand something first, Beast King. She lifted her chin. Every cage has 2 prisoners. A beat of silence stretched between them like a wire pulled to its limit. Then Fenris Vane's hand closed around her arm. Not violent, not gentle, simply absolute. And the last thing Seraphina saw of her burning home was the shattered throne of Ethelgard, golden and crumbling, reflected in the rain-dark windows as he walked her out. She did not look away until the doors closed. She did not cry. Data, she told herself. All of it is just data. The tower had 1 window, north-facing. Smart, she acknowledged grudgingly. Nothing but gray sky and sheer stone wall visible from the outside, no rooftop within leaping distance, no vine growth on the rock face below. Whoever had designed this prison had understood their business. The room itself, a stone floor with a narrow bed, a single oil lamp, a basin of water, and a wooden chair that had seen better decades. The door was iron, triple-bolted from the outside, with a small iron slot at the bottom for food trays. The ceiling was vaulted, with one weak point where the old mortar had begun to separate, useless for escape but worth cataloging. There was a cracked mirror on the eastern wall, gilt-framed and age-spotted, presumably left by a previous occupant. Seraphina walked the perimeter of the room exactly 3 times. On the second pass, she noted the guard rotation from the sound of boots in the corridor. 2 guards, trading positions, every 4 hours on the hour. One of them had a slight drag in his left step, old injury, probably knee, which would make him slower in a narrow space. The other walked too fast, too eager, the rhythm of someone young and jumpy. On the 3rd pass, she located the crack in the mirror. She pressed her thumb to the corner of the frame and applied careful, sustained pressure until a shard, 3 inches long, one edge sharp enough to matter, came free into her palm without a sound. She looked at it for a moment. Then she crossed to the narrow bed, worked a small gap open in the seam of the mattress ticking with her fingernail, and pressed the shard inside. She smoothed the fabric flat. She sat on the edge of the bed, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the iron door. Now, she thought, with the first thing approaching calm she had felt since the siege began. Now we begin. She did not sleep that first night. She sat in the wooden chair with the oil lamp burning low, and she thought about everything she knew. The Moon Devourer curse. what the Imperial scholars had documented before Fenris's forces destroyed the university at Crestholm. The pack hierarchy, the biological mechanics of the shift, the reported psychological deterioration in older alphas as the curse progressed, the way it devoured reason and left only hunger in its place. She thought about his eyes. Not the color. She had expected that, amber bleeding to crimson at the edges when he was pushed. Every account agreed on that detail. She thought about the quality of them. The intelligence sitting behind the violence. The way they had moved across the burning throne room like a mind building a map, not a predator in a frenzy. He wasn't losing reason yet. That was either very good for her survival, or very, very complicated. She thought about the way his scent had hit her. Unwilling and precise, the observation surfaced before she could file it away. It hadn't been unpleasant. It had been overwhelming and wrong and entirely, infuriatingly not unpleasant. She noted it. Filed it under, biological response, irrelevant. Monitor for recurrence, outside the wind picked up. Somewhere far below, a wolf howled once, short and declarative, a signal rather than a song, and then the night went quiet again. Serafina reached up and turned the oil lamp down to its lowest flame. She watched the door. She waited. He came on the third night. She had begun to wonder if he would at all. Had begun constructing contingency frameworks for a captivity with no access to the captor, which was a significantly less useful situation. When the triple bolts drew back at the 11th hour, and Fenris Vane folded his enormous frame through her doorway like a storm deciding to come inside. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply filled the threshold, and then he filled the room. And then there was very little of the room left that didn't belong to him. Serafina was in the chair. She had positioned it facing the door 3 nights ago, and had not moved it since. She had the wooden cup of cold water in her hands. She had not touched the food on the tray but had been drinking the water. Because dehydration was tactically stupid. And she looked up at him with the same expression she used to receive foreign dignitaries whose countries she intended to diplomatically dismantle. Polite, attentive, utterly unreadable, his scent arrived with him. Petrichor and pine and that electric ozone charge, filling the small tower room until her jasmine and cold marble scent had nowhere left to go. The two of them simply collided in the air between them. She noted the way her pulse adjusted, filed it. He looked at the tray. You haven't eaten. His voice was the first surprise. She had expected a growl, a bark, the blunt instrument of a man who communicated primarily through volume and threat. What she got was low, deliberate. Each word placed with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that quiet was more frightening than loud. I don't accept food from conquerors, she said. It sets a bad precedent. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one maybe in another life. He crossed to the window. Stood with his back to her. Looking out at the dark, one hand braced against the stone frame. The tribal tattoos on the back of his neck disappeared into the collar of his furs. His shoulders were a problem. Too broad, too present, making the room recalibrate around them. Your father surrendered the eastern garrison this morning, he said. I know, he turned his head slightly. How? The guard with the knee injury talks to himself when he's bored. I've been listening through the door. She paused. You should rotate your sentries more frequently. Loneliness makes men careless. The silence that followed was its own kind of information. She watched his jaw set. Watched him file that away the same way she filed things. She recognized the mechanism, the slight stillness that meant a mind was working rather than reacting. Interesting, she thought. He's not angry. He's recalibrating. You're not what I expected, he said finally. No, she agreed. You're not what I expected either. He turned from the window fully then. In the low lamplight, his amber eyes were darker than they had been in the throne room. Less crimson at the edges, she noted. Less pushed. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at terrain before a campaign. Thoroughly, without flattery. Locating the elevations and the weak points with equal dispassion. She let him look, she looked back. What did you expect? He asked, tears begging. Possibly a faint. She tilted her head slightly. What did you expect? Less conversation. Disappointment is character building, she said. I'm told. He moved from the window. Not toward her. He was too controlled for that, she was beginning to understand. But in a slow circuit of the room's perimeter, the way a wolf moves when it is deciding whether a space is safe. His eyes tracked the room as he walked. She watched him clock the tray, the basin, the chair, the bed. He stopped at the walls beside the cracked mirror. His gaze moved to the mirror's broken corner. To the small gap where the shard was missing. The silence stretched. Serafina did not move. Did not tighten her grip on the cup. Did not allow a single muscle in her face to shift from polite attentiveness. His eyes moved from the mirror to her hands, back to the mirror. He said nothing. He continued his circuit and came to stand in the center of the room, 6 feet from her chair. Close enough that his scent was a pressure rather than a presence. petrichor so thick she could nearly taste it, that ozone charge raising something along the back of her arms that she refused to acknowledge. Ask me something, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon? You've been constructing questions since I walked in. I can see it. He crossed his arms, the leather of his armor creaked. Ask. She studied him for a moment. Then she decided. Not the question she most wanted to ask. That one she would hold in reserve until she understood his psychological architecture better. Instead, she selected the second, most important question. The one that would tell her the most about how he thought. The Moon Devourer curse, she said. How many of your pack have lost full cognition in the last year? The room temperature dropped. It was not metaphorical. Something happened to his scent. The pine notes sharpened, went resinous and cold, and beneath the petrichor she caught the first ghost of it. Iron. Metal. The undertone that the accounts described. The smell of the curse pressing upward through him like groundwater through cracked stone. His amber eyes didn't flare. That was the more frightening thing. A man who flared was a man who was losing. Fenris Vane went still. That question, he said quietly, is not a question, it's a probe. Everything is a probe, she said. The question is whether you're intelligent enough to know what I'm probing for. 3 seconds of absolute silence. 11, he said. In the last 8 months, 3 of those were Betis. 1 was my second. She had not expected him to answer. The surprise moved through her like cold water, and she absorbed it, kept her face neutral, and nodded once. And before 8 months ago? 2 and 3 years. The acceleration, she said, half to herself, reaching for the shape of it. Something changed 8 months ago. A trigger, not a progression. The curse isn't a degenerative condition, it's a reactive one. She looked up at him. What happened 8 months ago? His jaw tightened. The last moonbound elder died, he said. She was the only one who still knew the original terms of the binding. Seraphina set her cup down on the floor beside the chair. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the Beast King standing in the middle of her prison room. Enormous and controlled, and carrying 11 lost minds on his back like silver arrows. There it is, she thought. There's the real war. You didn't take me to humiliate my father, she said slowly, following the logic to its conclusion with the focus of someone who had finally located the edges of a map she'd thought was limitless. You didn't take me as a political prize or a bargaining piece. Fenris said nothing. You took me because you need a mind, she said. You need someone who can read the old imperial texts. The ones the Church of the Zealous Empire sealed in the Ethelgard vault. The binding records, the original curse documents, she paused. You need a scholar who is also a royal. Because only a royal seal opens the lower vault. And my father would die before he helped you. She looked at him directly. But you thought I might not. The silence was its own answer. She should have felt frightened. By the logic of her situation. Captive, isolated. Her survival contingent on the goodwill of a manson whose species ate the moon. She should have felt the ground sliding under her. Instead, she felt the particular, clarifying calm of a chessboard finally revealing its true configuration. You need me, she said. Don't flatter yourself, he said. But he didn't move toward the door. I'm not flattering anyone, she held his gaze. I'm identifying the terms of a negotiation, she let that land. You have my body in a tower. I have the key to your vault, and the knowledge to read what's inside it. We can spend the next several weeks performing dominance rituals at each other. She gestured faintly at the room, at him, at the general theater of her captivity. Or we can be useful to one another. Fenris looked at her for a long time. In the lamplight his eyes were fully amber now, no crimson at the edges, no iron in his scent. Just that deep, unreadable gold. And behind it the thing she was beginning to understand was the most dangerous thing about him. He was thinking. You'd help me, he said. In exchange for what? My father's life, guaranteed. In writing, with your blood seal, which I understand is binding for your kind. And? She hadn't expected him to assume an and. Another small recalibration. Access to your pack's historical records. Every account of the curse from the inside. I want to understand what we're actually breaking before I try to break it. We, he said. We, she confirmed. The moment broke. He moved to the door with the same unhurried, absolute economy of motion he brought to everything. His hand found the bolt. He paused with his back to her. The guard with the knee, he said. His name is Aldrich. He's been with my pack since he was 14. He talks to himself because he lost his mate to the curse 6 months ago. A beat. He's not careless. He's grieving. He drew the bolt. Eat the food, princess, you'll need the strength. The door closed. The 3 bolts drew home, one after another. Seraphina sat in the chair and stared at the iron door and thought about a man carrying 11 lost minds and 1 grieving guard and an entire dying species, all of it held together by the force of his own considerable, terrifying will. She thought about the ghost of iron beneath his petrichor. She thought about the way he had seen the missing mirror shard and chosen not to say so. She reached down and picked up the cup of water. She drank. He came back the next night. and the night after that. By the 5th visit, she had stopped counting the hours between them, which she noted with clinical displeasure, and immediately began counting again. The pattern established itself with the precision of something neither of them had consciously designed. He arrived at the 11th hour. He did not sit. She had never seen him sit, but moved through the room or stood at the window while they talked. She remained in the chair. The 6 feet of distance between them became its own kind of structure. A negotiating table that happened to be made of air. He brought her books on the 4th night. Old ones, their spines cracked, their titles in the old Wildertongue script. She had looked at the first page and then looked up at him, and he had said, without expression, "Your pronunciation of the dialectal suffix is probably wrong. Most imperial scholars get it wrong. Teach me," she said. He had. The chess match evolved. She asked about the curse. He answered with precision and occasional, startling honesty that she suspected he extended to very few people. She offered analysis. He listened in the particular focused ways of someone who was genuinely, seriously listening, not merely waiting for their turn to speak. She found it, disarming was the wrong word. She found it inconvenient, because inconvenient was safe. Inconvenient she could work with. What she could not work with. What she was beginning to catalog with increasing concern in the private ledger she kept in her head, was the way his scent changed when she said something that surprised him. The petrichor deepened, the ozone charge sharpened, as though her mind, specifically, was doing something to his wolf that his conscious architecture had not approved, and could not entirely suppress. She filed it. She did not examine the filing. On the 9th night he told her about his second. His name had been Kalen. He had been Fenris's closest beta since adolescence, the one who translated the Alpha's silences for the pack, who managed the war councils when Fenris's wolf grew too loud to leave room for politics. He had been the last one to go. Fenris described it without effect. Precisely, clinically, in the same register he used to discuss troop positioning and curse mechanics. But Seraphina, who had spent 9 nights learning the specific grammar of his silences, heard the thing underneath it. The thing he did not have the vocabulary for. Or perhaps simply did not allow himself. "He didn't know me at the end," Fenris said. He was at the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the stone. He was still there physically, still alive. But the thing looking out of his eyes, he stopped. Wasn't him, she finished quietly. No, the silence between them was different from the early silences. Less like a wall. More like a room they were both standing in. "That's when you accelerated the campaign," she said. Not accusatory. Just following the timeline to its logic. "You didn't invade Ethelgard for territory. You invaded because the vault was here, and you were running out of time." He turned from the window. And for the first time since she had known him, 9 nights, which was not long, which was an absurdly short time, to feel like she was beginning to know anything. He looked, very briefly, like what he was. A man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and who was almost tired enough for it to show. Almost. Yes, she looked at him, at the scarred jaw, and the amber eyes, and the tribal tattoos, and the absolutely unassailable exterior, and at the hairline fracture running through the center of it, that she suspected she was the only person in this castle positioned to see. She made a decision. "I'll open the vault," she said, not as a prisoner following terms. As, she chose the word carefully, a collaborator, with the agreement we discussed. "Your father's life. And yours," she said, which surprised them both. "My king." The southern perimeter. Fenris's eyes went to hers. 1 second. Amber, unreadable, carrying something she hadn't yet found a name for, and then the predator snapped back into place like a visor dropping. He moved to the door. "Don't open the vault without me," he said. "I don't have the key," she pointed out. "No." He glanced back at her. "But you'd find a way," the bolts drew home. She sat in the chair in the lamplight and pressed her fingers to her sternum, feeling the way her pulse was behaving with exactly the kind of insubordination she had specifically instructed it not to engage in. Inconvenient, she told herself firmly. She picked up the Wildertongue text and found her page. She did not sleep for a long time. She felt the siege before she heard it. A vibration in the stone floor, deep, rhythmic, wrong, that traveled up through the legs of her chair and into her spine at 3 hours past midnight. She was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, working through a passage in the 3rd Wildertongue text Fenris had brought her, the one with the original binding terminology that the imperial scholars had mistranslated for 2 centuries because they had confused the suffix for eternal with the suffix for conditional. Conditional. The curse was not meant to be permanent. It had a release mechanism built into its original architecture that every subsequent scholar had missed because they had been reading the wrong word. She had been sitting very still with that knowledge for 40 minutes, turning it over, examining its implications, when the floor began to shake. She went to the window. The northern courtyard below was chaos. torchlight fracturing against silver armor. Silver, the Zelza's signature. Her brother's forces, pouring through a breach in the lower eastern wall. Fenris's packwolves were shifting mid-run, the transformation happening in violent, beautiful lurches of shadow and bone. And then they were no longer men but something vast and dark and terrifyingly fast. Closing the distance to the silver line with a speed that made her breath catch. But there were so many silver soldiers. Edric, she thought. Her brother's name landed in her chest like a stone in still water. You didn't wait. She spun from the window. The bolt hit a third time and the iron door shuddered in its frame and then went still. Not Fenris. Wrong rhythm, wrong force. Fenris moved with economy. This was panic wrapped in armor. One of her brother's advance scouts then sent up the tower with instructions she could guess well enough. Eliminate the asset before Vane can use her. She reached into the mattress seam. The mirror shard was cold in her palm. 3 inches, one sharp edge. She held it the way her weapons instructor had taught her to hold a blade when you didn't have a blade. Low, angled, your entire body behind the intention of it. She positioned herself beside the door frame, not in front of it, beside. The bolt hit again. The hinges screamed. Then nothing. Silence. Then a sound she recognized. A short, wet finality from the other side of the door, and something heavy hitting the corridor floor. The bolt drew back, all 3 fast and certain. Fenris filled the doorway. There was blood on his jaw that wasn't his. His amber eyes found her immediately, dropped to the shard in her hand, moved back to her face, and something passed through his expression too fast for her to name. Come, he said, the courtyard, I know. He was already moving into the corridor. Stay behind me. Don't argue. I wasn't going to argue, she said, which was partially true. He moved through the castle like he had built it. Which, she realized, he effectively had. He had occupied it long enough to have mapped every corridor, every servant's passage, every structural weakness that the imperial architects had failed to adequately disguise. He took her through a servant's staircase behind the eastern scullery, down 2 levels, and into a stone passage that ran beneath the main hall. She kept up. She was not a woman who failed to keep up. The sounds of the siege pressed through the walls on all sides, muffled but omnipresent, the castle itself seeming to groan with the weight of it. Once, a section of ceiling 20 feet ahead of them dropped a cascade of plaster and dust as something massive impacted the floor above. Fenris's arm came back without looking, a reflex purely instinctive, and pressed her flat to the wall until the debris settled. His forearm across her collarbone. Her jasmine and cold marble scent rising to meet his petrichor in the cramped dark of the passage. She was aware of his warmth even through the leather of his armor, aware of the way his body had positioned itself, angled toward the debris between her and it, without a single conscious deliberate thought. He removed his arm the moment the dust cleared, said nothing, moved forward, she followed, said nothing, filed it under a category she had not previously needed and did not yet have a name for. They emerged into the inner courtyard through a cellar grate. The night was smoke and torchlight, and the sound of silver on fur. Fenris's wolves were holding the eastern breach, but the southern gate had partially given way, and the silver soldiers were funneling through, in disciplined columns. Her brother's influences, that discipline, Edric had always been meticulous, and the crossbowmen had taken position on the outer wall. Fenris stopped at the courtyard's edge, assessed. His eyes moved across the battlefield with the same thoroughness she had watched him apply to everything, building the map, locating the variables. The passage to the north annex, he said, 30 feet across the open courtyard. We move on my signal. What's the signal? You'll know now, he said. They ran. She was fast. She had always been fast. Her tutors had disapproved. Her father had quietly encouraged it. And she covered the courtyard's 30 feet with her gown bunched in both fists and her eyes on the north annex door ahead. She didn't see the crossbowman on the southern parapet reposition. She didn't see him track her across the open ground. She heard the bolts release. And then the world lurched sideways as Fenris's body hit hers. Enormous, total, no hesitation in it, throwing her into the shelter of the annex wall as the volley crossed the space where she had been standing. The sound he made was not a growl. It was something lower. Something that came from deeper than sound. She caught herself against the stone wall and spun. He was still standing. That was the first thing. He was still on his feet, which meant she had approximately 2 seconds before her mind caught up to what her eyes were processing. The 3 silver-tipped crossbow bolts embedded in his back between his shoulder blades and below. 2 deep, one at an angle. The silver already doing what silver did to his kind. The scent of his blood changing from petrichor and iron to something sharper. Wrong, a burning metallic note that did not belong in a living body. Fenris. His voice was still controlled, still that precise, deliberate instrument. But underneath it, for the first time, she heard the effort it was costing. He got them inside. He got the annex door barred. Then he went down to one knee against the wall, and the controlled exterior cracked just enough for her to see the pain underneath it, vast and white and carefully, ferociously contained. The chamber was a ruined records room. Shelves half collapsed, documents scattered, an overturned brazier in the corner still breathing smoke. No lamp, but the fire in the castle's eastern wing was throwing orange light through the high narrow windows. Enough to see by. Enough to see him. He had made it to the wall and positioned himself against it, sitting, one knee raised, his back presenting the 3 bolts to the room. His breathing was measured, deliberate. 4 counts, the same rhythm she used. She crossed to him and crouched behind him and looked at the bolts. Silver-tipped, barbed, she catalogued. Deep penetration on the center and left. The right bolt is angled. Less depth, but the silver contact is broader. He can't shift to heal with these in. The silver will spread if they stay. I need to remove them, she said.
I know.
It will hurt, I know. I don't have anything to, I know. He said it without impatience. Without anything except that same enormous, terrible steadiness. Do it. She tore a length from the hem of her silk gown. She folded half of it and pressed it to the first entry point, and wrapped her other hand around the bolt's shaft and felt the way he went, absolutely rigid. Every muscle in that vast back locking down simultaneously. His breathing pausing for 1 second, the petrichor spiking sharp and electric around them. She pulled. The first bolt came free. She pressed the silk hard against the wound and reached for the second. And he said nothing. Made nothing except the one controlled, barely audible sound of a man absorbing pain with the entire force of his will. And she pulled the second free and the third, and pressed both palms against his back and held the silk there, feeling the heat of him through it, the terrible wet warmth of his blood soaking through her hands. His blood smelled of burning and metal, and beneath it, beneath the wrong notes of the silver's damage, the familiar dark earth and petrichor, him. Still present. You're still here, she said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Yes. A pause, his breathing was evening slightly. Disappointed? Don't be glib, she said. You just took 3 crossbow bolts. 2, he said, the third was shallow. 3, she said firmly. I counted. Something that might, in better lighting, in a less ruined chamber, in a version of their lives that made more sense, have been. A quiet laugh moved through his back under her palms. She became aware, gradually and then all at once, of several things simultaneously. Her hands were on his bare skin where the bolt had torn through his furs. The silk was soaked through, and her palms were pressed directly against the terrible heat of him. His back rising and falling with each breath, alive beneath her hands with an insistence that felt personal. Felt like an argument her logic could not quite answer. His scent in the enclosed chamber. Petrichor and ozone and that bright metallic edge of silver damage. And underneath all of it the deep, dark, present smell of him. Her own scent, jasmine and cold marble, rising to meet it in the smoke-thickened air until she couldn't entirely locate where his began and hers stopped. The fire in the eastern wing crackling. The siege sounds distant and muffled. The 2 of them alone in the ruin of the records room with only the orange light and the smoke and the fact. The simple, unmanageable, unfileable fact that he had thrown his body over hers without a single second of hesitation. Not strategy, not calculation, not the preservation of a useful asset, reflex. Pure and unconsidered, and therefore, in the private ledger she kept in her head, worth more than any deliberate act either of them had ever performed. She took her hands from his back. She moved around to face him. He looked at her. The amber eyes were dark in the orange firelight, the crimson entirely absent. The wolf quieted, she realized, not by dominance or control but by something else. Something she was less equipped to name. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. Why did you? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because, he said finally, some things happen before you can decide whether to let them. The chamber was very warm. The fire. The smoke. His heat radiating from 3 feet away, filling the space between them with something that was not quite petrichor, and not quite lightning, but was built from both. She leaned forward and kissed him. Not impulsively, she was not, had never been, an impulsive woman. She did it the way she did everything. With full awareness of what she was choosing, and why, and what it would cost her. His hand came up to her jaw. Enormous. With a gentleness so at odds with every other thing about him, that it broke something open behind her sternum. That she had been keeping carefully sealed for 9 nights, maybe longer, maybe since a burning throne room, and a step forward when every instinct said step back. Outside the siege raged. Inside the ruined records room, in the smoke and the orange firelight, with her hand still bearing the copper stain of his blood, and his pulse beating warm and alive under her palm. The war stopped. For a little while, the war stopped. 3 weeks passed. She counted them the way she counted everything. Precisely, without sentiment. Each day filed and annotated in the private ledger behind her eyes. The siege had broken before dawn the night of the records room. Edric's forces had retreated to the tree line, bloodied and reorganizing, and the castle had sealed its wounds the way all occupied things eventually did, with grim efficiency and very little tenderness. The tower room was the same. She was not. She catalogued the change with the same clinical attention she applied to everything, which did not make it less alarming. It simply made it documented. A scientist naming a disease does not thereby cure it. The facts were these. She slept now. She ate the food from the tray without principle-based objection. She had progressed through all 6 Wildertongue texts and had begun cross-referencing the original binding terminology with the Imperial Vault records that Fenris had, true to their negotiation, granted her access to 3 days after the siege, escorting her down himself with his hand at her back in the narrow safe stairwell, not quite touching, close enough to feel the warmth of it. She had found the conditional release mechanism in the 7th Vault document. She had not yet told him. This was the fact she examined most carefully, in the quiet hours before he arrived each night, turning it over the way she had turned the mirror shard over in the weeks before she had needed it. Why hadn't she told him? She had the information. She had the terms of their negotiation. She had every rational incentive to deliver her finding and secure her father's safety, and begin constructing whatever came next. She hadn't told him. She pressed 2 fingers to her sternum in the dark and felt her pulse, and did not examine the answer too closely. He still came at the 11th hour. He still did not sit. But the circuit of the room had changed. Tighter now, closer to her chair, the 6 feet of negotiating table air between them having quietly, without formal acknowledgement, contracted to 3. Sometimes 2. Sometimes close enough that she could feel the warmth of him before his scent reached her, which was its own kind of data that she had stopped being able to file cleanly. They talked about the curse, about the binding documents, about the old Wildertongue passages she was working through, and what they suggested about the original intent of the Moon Devourer transformation. Not a curse at all, she had come to believe, but a seal. A biological containment of something older and more dangerous than the wolf itself. And the degradation they were seeing was not madness, but a pressure release from a container that had never been meant to hold indefinitely. He listened, with that particular focused attention she had catalogued from the beginning, asked precise, intelligent questions that consistently surprised her, occasionally corrected her Wildertongue pronunciation, with a directness that had initially been irritating and had gradually become. She would not use the word comfortable. She would use the word useful. She would use the word useful, and she would not look at it too hard. On the 14th night, he brought her a blanket, heavier than the one already on the bed, dark fur, Wildertongue's mate, smelling of pine and cold air and faintly, irrevocably of him. He set it on the end of the bed without comment. She said nothing. She pulled it over her shoulders that night, after he left, and sat with the Wildertongue texts, and did not address the warmth of it. On the 19th night she told him about the conditional suffix. Not all of it. The release mechanism she held a moment longer, for reasons she was only beginning to be honest with herself about. But the suffix. The fundamental mistranslation that had sent 2 centuries of Imperial scholars in the wrong direction. She laid out precisely and completely, watching his face as the implications landed. He was very still. Financial, he said. The curse was designed to end, she said. It was never meant to be permanent. Someone changed the binding, or allowed it to degrade beyond its original parameters, and every scholar since has been working from a corrupted baseline. He sat down. She noted this. In 19 nights she had never seen him sit. He dropped into the wooden chair. Her chair, the chair she had vacated to stand at the window, and put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands flat against his face, and stayed there for a long moment. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard below, and gave him the silence because she understood, by now, the grammar of it. When his silences were thinking, and when they were carrying, and when they needed room. This one needed room. Kaelin, he said finally. His voice was different. She had never heard it different before. If the seal was conditional, if it can be reversed. Those who have already lost cognition, she said carefully. I don't know yet. The document suggests the reversal addresses the progression, not necessarily the damage already done. I want to be honest with you about what I don't know. A pause. Yes, he said. I know. Another pause. Thank you. She turned from the window. He was looking at her. The amber eyes in the lamplight were. She had run out of clinical language for what they were. She had used unreadable for weeks, and it had stopped being accurate without her finding a replacement. Seraphina, he said. No title, no princess, no asset, no prize. Just her name in that low, deliberate voice. Placed with the same precision he applied to everything, except that the precision this time felt less like control and more like care. Like a thing being held carefully because it mattered. Her pulse did the thing she had told it not to do. We're close, she said, because it was true, and because it was safe. I need 3 more days with the vault documents. He nodded. He stood. He moved to the door and paused. And she thought he was going to say something. Thought she saw it in the set of his shoulders. Something building. And then the moment passed, and the bolts drew home, and she was alone with the fur blanket, and the lamplight, and the entirely inconvenient truth she had been not examining for 19 days. She pressed her hand to her abdomen. The thought arrived quietly, without drama, without the fanfare she might have expected, from something that was about to rearrange every calculation she had made. She sat with it in the silence. Oh, she thought. She was working by lamplight when her brother came through the window. Not the door. The window. The north-facing window she had assessed on her first day as offering no viable escape route, which she now revised to, no viable escape route for her. For a man with a rope, a grappling iron, and the Zealot Corps' training in vertical siege tactics, apparently manageable. Edric dropped onto the stone floor without a sound. He looked exactly as she remembered. Younger than Fenris by nearly a decade. Fine-featured, fair, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and a quality of absmoral certainty that had always been, in her assessment, his most dangerous attribute. He was wearing dark clothes over silver chainmail, the chainmail her brother never removed. A devotional habit, the armor of the righteous. In his right hand a blade, softly, almost tenderly. Edric. She set the Wildertongue text down on the floor beside the chair. Her voice came out even, 4 counts in. You brought a blade to my throat the last time we were in the same room. That wasn't, he said. I needed to know if you were compromised. If the beast had. Chosen your words carefully before you finished that sentence, she said. His jaw tightened. He moved closer and crouched in front of her chair. The blade angled down. Not threatening, not yet, and looked at her with something that was genuinely, painfully, fraternal concern layered over something colder and more resolute underneath. Are you well, he asked. I'm a prisoner in a tower, Edric. Are you well, he repeated, specific, deliberate. She held his gaze. Yes, something moved through his expression. Relief and its shadow. Something that was not quite relief, because it came with the blade still in his hand, and the silver chainmail still on his back, and the absolute moral certainty still in his eyes. Father is alive, he said. Vane has honored that much. I know. He's using you, Sarah. Whatever he's told you. Whatever success he's given you. Whatever he's made you feel. Edric's voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone who had prepared this speech. He took you to use the vault. Once he has what he needs, you have no value. You understand that. She looked at her brother. At the face she had known her entire life, and the certainty behind it, and the way that certainty had always been. Not wrong, exactly, but fixed. Immovable. Unable to accommodate information that disrupted its architecture. He could have left me in that courtyard, she said quietly. 3 weeks ago. Silver bolts. He chose not to. He chose to protect his asset. He chose, she said without thinking about it. That's the relevant part. Edric was quiet for a moment. Then he set the blade on the floor between them, and took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with something that was entirely, genuinely, fraternal. I'm getting you out, he said, tonight. I have a rope on the north wall, 12 of our best on the outer perimeter. Once you're clear, we can be at the tree line inn. And the pack, she said. His pack, what happens to them? A pause. Edric. The moon devourers are an abomination, he said, gently, as though this were a kindness. The church has been clear. Once the Beast King is neutralized. They're dying, she said. The curse is killing them. They're not an abomination. They're a people with a biological condition and a 2-century scholarly error standing between them and survival. Sarah. I'm pregnant. The word landed in the room like a stone through ice. Edric went very still. She had not planned to say it. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps some part of her had understood that this conversation was always going to arrive at this fact, and that there was no version of the negotiation that could avoid it. She sat with the stillness, and let him absorb the weight of it, and watched his face move through shock and grief and something harder and colder settling underneath. Then it's worse, this a thought, he said finally. His voice had changed. The tenderness was still there, but it had been subordinated to the thing underneath it. The certainty. A child that bridges the line between the Empire and the beasts. Do you understand what the church would call that, Sarah? What they would do with that? Yes, she said. Which is why I'm telling you and not them. He released her hands. He stood, he picked up the blade, and then he held it to her throat, not violently. Almost gently, the way their father used to rest a hand on her shoulder before delivering difficult news. The blade was silver-edged. Of course it was. Edric had always been thorough, and cold against her pulse point. I love you, he said. You know that, I know. Open the internal courtyard gates tonight, he said. The mechanism is on the south wall of the antechamber. I've had the castle schematics for weeks. You can reach it from the servants' passage below the east scullery. He paused. Open the gates and walk out with me, and I will protect you. I will tell the church the child was taken. I will handle it. Handle it. She looked at her brother over the edge of his blade, and felt something that was not fear, and was not anger, and was not grief, or was perhaps all three of them compressed into a single clarifying point. And if I don't, she said, then I set this keep ablaze, he said. And I tell our father you died defending the Empire's honor. Which is the truth, in a way. Because you are going to do the right thing, Sarah. You always do the right thing. He lowered the blade. He moved to the window. Before the third bell, he said, the gates. He went back up the rope. The window latch clicked shut behind him. Serafina sat in the chair for a long time. She pressed her hand to her abdomen. She thought about the conditional suffix, and the vault documents, and 3 more days she did not have. She thought about 11 mines and 1 grieving guard, and a fur blanket that smelled of pine and dark earth. She thought about a body thrown over hers in an open courtyard without a single second of hesitation. She thought about her father. She thought about her child. She stood up. She crossed to the servants' passage access behind the east wall. A loose stone, third from the bottom, which she had located on day 4 and had been waiting to need, and pressed it, and felt the passage open behind the wall. She walked through the dark without a lamp. She found the antechamber. She found the gate mechanism on the south wall, exactly where Edric had said it would be. She stood in front of it for a long time. She came out onto the high balcony above the inner courtyard as the Silver Army flooded through the open gates below. The noise was immense, torchlight shouting. The sound of wolves beginning to shift in response to the alarm. The pack mobilizing from sleep into crisis in the span of seconds. Fenris came into the courtyard at a run. He was moving toward the gates, assessing the breach, the Alpha already building the tactical response. She could see it in the way his body read the space, the way his eyes moved, the way the pack oriented toward him automatically like iron filings toward a lodestone. Then he stopped. He looked up. He found her on the balcony exactly the way he always found her. Immediately, without searching. As though his wolf had a fixed coordinate for her that required no effort to locate. She looked down at him. The Silver Army was moving through the gates. His pack was reacting, the courtyard erupting into the sound and violence of a battle none of them had been prepared for. His second, the new one, a young beta named Oren, who had taken Kaelin's place, was pulling at his arm, urgent, demanding his attention. Fenris didn't look away from her. She didn't look away from him, his amber eyes in the torchlight, her expression giving him nothing. Giving him the face she used for treaty negotiations, and execution orders, and every room that needed to believe she was not breakable. Giving him the face she had worn in a burning throne room, when she had stepped toward him instead of back. He looked at her with those golden eyes and she watched, the moment he understood. Watched it move through him like silver through a wound, the comprehension and its cost arriving simultaneously. His jaw set, his chest rose once, the beta pulled him away, the courtyard swallowed him. Serafina stood on the balcony, and looked at the place where he had been standing, and pressed both hands flat against the stone railing, feeling the cold of it, the solidity of it, the realness of it. Her face didn't change, behind her eyes, the vault documents. The conditional release mechanism she hadn't told him about yet. The 3 more days she needed that she had just bought. Exactly 3 days before Edric's forces would expect her to have delivered the asset, and could no longer be delayed without suspicion. 3 days. She had just handed Fenris Vane the worst night of his life and the only path to saving his species. And she could not tell him which one it was yet. Not without destroying the plan. She didn't just open the gates to his kingdom. The courtyard seemed to say, silver and fire and chaos below her, his pack bleeding for a betrayal they couldn't understand yet. She had just destroyed the monster who trusted her. Or she had saved him. She wouldn't know which for 3 more days. She stood on the balcony in the cold, and waited for the part of her that was a strategist to win the argument against the part of her that was something else, something newer, something that had a pulse of its own, and pressed against her ribs when she thought about amber eyes and a fur blanket, and 3 silver bolts. The strategist won. It always won. She pressed her hand once briefly to her abdomen. Then she turned and walked back through the dark. Oh my God, she actually opened the gates. If your jaw is currently on the floor, you are not alone. But let's settle the debate right now in the comments. Do you think Serafina is a cold-blooded traitor who just ruined the only man who protected her? Or do you think our mastermind princess has a trick up her sleeve to save the pack in those 3 days? Drop your theories below. I am reading every single one of them. If you need to know how Fenris survives this night, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now so you don't miss part 2 the second it drops. See you in the comments.